All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is David Gottfried. I'm the director of the NNCI coordinating office here at Georgia Tech. Welcome to another NNCI webinar, this time focusing on our innovation and entrepreneurship activities. And before I turn it over to my colleague, Matt Hull, to make the introductions, get things started, I'll just remind everybody that you can find upcoming webinars, upcoming events, both in person and virtual, on the NNCI events page. You can also find recordings of past webinars on the NNCI YouTube page, which you can find by just Googling YouTube and NNCI. And then lastly, I think that our panelists will be taking questions from our attendees, and you can put those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, I will stop talking and pass it off to my colleague, Matt Hull.
All right. Thanks, David. Really appreciate the introduction here and the opportunity to host our colleagues from Stanford. So I'm Matt Hull. I'm the Associate Director for Innovation and Entrepreneurship for the NNCI Coordinating Office, and also our Nano Earth site here at Virginia Tech, which is one of the 16 sites within the NNCI. We're joined today by three outstanding panelists from Nano at Stanford, or from Stanford, and they're connected to us through our colleagues at Nano at Stanford, particularly Sarah Ostrovsky and Debbie Sineski, who've really played a big role in helping us facilitate this connection. What we try to do through our Innovation Entrepreneurship webinar series through the NNCI is really highlight outstanding stories about translation and folks who are not only working in nano-related domains, but also bringing technologies to market and have some insights to share on that process, which can be quite complex and challenging. And so today I'm joined by three panelists: Yossi Feinberg, who's the Adams Distinguished Professor of Management and Professor of Economics at Stanford; Jennifer Dion, who's a Professor of Material Science and, by courtesy of radiology, Stanford University, and Chan Zuckerberg investigator and co-founder of Pumpkin Seed. So hopefully, Jennifer, you could help me with the introduction there a little bit when we proceed to that step, but quite a few titles there. Keegan Cook, who's the director of the Stanford Ecopreneurship Program at Stanford. And so what we're going to do today is just sort of walk through a series of a few questions and learn a little bit about the Stanford innovation ecosystem, the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Last year, we were fortunate to visit as the NNCI entire infrastructure convened at Stanford, and we got to hear a little bit about the infrastructure. And the purpose of today's meeting is to really share that more broadly with an audience beyond just our NNCI attendees. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive right in. And the first step here will be for each of our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about the program that they represent at Stanford. And so I see Keegan first on my screen, so I'm going to let Keegan take it, and then we'll go to Jennifer and Yossi.
Well, thanks very much. Happy to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. So my name is Keegan Cook. I lead this thing called Stanford Ecopreneurship. This is a joint program between our Dorr School of Sustainability and our Graduate School of Business. And our whole goal is to bolster sustainability-focused entrepreneurship, or ecopreneurship, across Stanford and beyond. This is all funded by a gift. And we do all sorts of things, from supporting classes to creating our own co-curricular programs to running conferences, anything in support of sustainability-focused entrepreneurship on campus.
Outstanding.
Cool. I'll go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Dion. Matt did a great job introducing me. At Stanford, I have mainly been the beneficiary of many of the programs that you will hear about from our other panelists. I have been a faculty member for 14 years, and about 2 years ago spun out a company that I co-founded, Pumpkin Seed, which is developing T-cell mediated therapies. But I've also had students found companies, including Antora, which does thermal batteries, and also Arabesque, which does bacterial diagnostics based on Raman, and have participated in programs related to the ecopreneurship that Keegan mentioned, including the Tomcat Center for Sustainability, which has an innovation transfer program as well as StartX, which is a founder community on campus for students, postdocs, staff, and faculty. And then I've also worked very closely with the Office of Technology Licensing, both for filing patents as well as licensing out patents when our startups or other companies needed them.
Outstanding. And Yossi?
Thanks. And you're already bombarded with all the things that are going on. And you know, Jen and Keegan are a big part of a lot of what's happening on campus. I'm Yossi Feinberg, so I'm a faculty in the business school. I'd like to say I've been part of the furniture for a while now after 26 years. I'm the faculty director of a program that's called Stanford Ignite. This has been around for 19 years, actually, and it's a program that is designed to help people with no business background, you know, similar to scientists, mostly postdocs and PhD students, but also sometimes faculty, take their sort of technical innovation and sort of give them the tools to build a business out of it. So that's my background.
Outstanding. So we have a great group here. I'm going to go ahead and start with a few of the questions here because it may take us a while. We're going to try to have all three of you go through them and answer them. And I may start in reverse order on this and give the first one to Yossi. So the first question here is, what are major gaps in the ways that scientists with no business background approach entrepreneurship? What have you noticed in your 19 years of experience with Stanford Ignite and beyond? What have you seen?
So I think I'll start with one dimension, which is sort of the individual attitude that I see. I see a lot of people who do science, they want to leave the business to someone else. I think when you do that, that's a mistake. There's the opposite thing, which is just diving into business and thinking, hey, I'm super smart. How difficult can it be? And that's where a lot of issues arise, especially when it comes to not realizing and not being aware of how many critical aspects depend on experience and knowledge and that exists out there, but it's actually hard to come by. And maybe the third aspect, and then you know I'll give the other panelists probably they have things to add. But the third aspect from an individual perspective is sort of bringing the scientific approach, right? Mm-hmm. As scientists, we grow in a certain environment, there's a certain culture, there's a way we approach problems. And here's one example, right? We don't jump steps, we don't skip, we don't do things other than perfectly. If you're gonna build a successful business, you're gonna skip a lot of things and do them imperfectly, otherwise you're not gonna move. So again, thinking about it's new traits and new skills, a new environment in which you operate, and being open to that is one of the things that I think is correlated with successful translation.
That's wonderful. So Keegan, Jen, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think that was a really great overview. Also, you know, pretty thought-provoking. One thing I'll add is there are so many good books on how to launch a successful venture, and I don't want to endorse one in particular, but I will because it's kind of helped me mentor my science and engineering students who want to start companies. It's a book called Innovation, the 5 Disciplines for Creating What Customers Want. And it's from SRI. So a lot of the stories are maybe a little, you know, historical or dated. But what I really like in that book is how they go about helping you define a value proposition. And they have this approach that they call NABC. The N stands for define the need. The A stands for define the approach. The B is the benefits, and then C is competition or cost. And since you asked, like, what are the differences between, or what do scientists need to know in starting a business? What I find a lot of times in science is people start with the approach Like they think that the value is in the approach. But I like how this book emphasizes, putting the end first, really defining, what is the customer need, and then, kind of, being almost agnostic to approach, finding the best approach that actually meets that need. And I think if people who want to start companies can define a good value proposition with this NABC kind of mnemonic in mind, it creates a much stronger, value for, an engineer trying to start a company.
That's great. I can only echo what Yossi and Jen described. And I'll also say something we've noticed with a lot of our PhD students and postdocs in particular is an initial shyness to starting their customer discovery process. After you've worked on a technology for many years, there's an inertia that builds of like, oh, okay, I'll start my customer discovery after my next experiment. I just want to validate that technical feasibility just a little bit more before I talk to people. And what we find is that it is super helpful to just start the customer discovery process. What Jen was describing, identifying the need that you are trying to solve, because very often that will inform your technical development going forward as well.
Well, and that ties in a little bit to also what Yossi said, where, and correct me if I'm wrong, Yossi, I thought I heard you say something, it's okay to mess up. You're gonna, you got to get started. Things aren't going to be done perfectly. So you're going to be proceeding and taking on some things that maybe you're not as familiar with, and you're going to make some mistakes, and you got to find a way to keep going. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. So, very good insight here. Let's see here. I think we've done a good job answering that question. Again, if folks have questions, I think we can feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A there, and we will try to get to them as we roll through the questions here. The next question that I kind of a follow on to that question is, how could these gaps be addressed at the university level and or a network of academic institutions? So I think Jen cited the book resource. That's certainly one that we can share broadly. But can each of you sort of speak to the broader implications of how we can address these gaps at the university level, and even what can we do, across institutions, if you can think of examples of those. And Keegan, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, happy to brainstorm a few ideas. Something that we found to be effective is what my colleague likes to describe as mixing the peanut butter and the jelly, which is, taking the technical talent and the technical folks and mixing them with folks that are more business oriented or have particular experience in an industry. Oftentimes that leads to good outcomes on both ends. Something else that we've found with our technical folks is that with lean startup methodology, which is kind of pervasive in a lot of our courses and programs, it breaks down entrepreneurship into a hypothesis-driven approach. And that is more comfortable. It's a more comfortable framing for a lot of our scientists who see their business development as a series of experiments that they need to execute to de-risk their business model. So that is something that we found to be helpful.
Yeah. A great point. We can apply our science that led to the innovation to the translational process. Let's see, I see Yossi's unmuted. Did you want to weigh in next, Yossi?
Wow, it's a big one. Over the last few decades, that's not only universities, but I would say governments, municipalities all over the world have been struggling with, how do I create an ecosystem? And when you look and you study the things that were successful and not successful, I think, and this is more of a tip to leaders within the university. Here's the thing that I've seen that a lot of organizations try to do, and this is really a pattern that I've seen all over the world. Universities try to implement a new system with the idea of let's define the ideal system, and then let's go ahead and try to implement it. And the two things that are really problematic with this approach. One is the ideal system is actually different from ecosystem to ecosystem. You know, different universities have different strengths. The faculty have different capabilities. The type of businesses, the type of innovation that happens there is different. And sort of the people attitudes also are different. So you have to start with a deep understanding of where are we and where we want to go that really fits what we can do best. And those are the things that we've seen have been successful when there is this understanding. And the second part, which is even more crucial, is it's not flipping switches. A lot of the aspects that create this powerful ecosystems, they take time, they take process, you know, things like culture in the organization. You know, when I call someone across the street and, you know, I need some advice from Jen, and I need to send a student to Jen, it's not going to take 3 months for that meeting to happen. And people will understand what, you know, the experience will be there in the ecosystem. And that's not something that you can build in a month, 2 or 6 months. So these are the two major things that I would say if you're thinking about trying to move a whole ecosystem, that you know need to be taken carefully. And maybe the third thing, and I'll stop there, which is the leadership in the university needs to have this awareness that it's not their normal playing ground. It's not, you know, and that can lead to sort of making different type of mistakes, either, you know, relying on people that have some incentives or some interest that, you know, purely financial on the one side, or making errors on the other side, which is being too constraining and not seeing how to build sort of the, you know, leverage the financial incentives.
Yossi, you made a great point there that I just need to emphasize here. The ecosystem, you talk about ecosystems, they're different from Stanford to Virginia Tech to Georgia Tech to even to all universities across the country. And it really emphasizes sort of what we've been finding through the National Nano Coordinated Infrastructure, just how unique those ecosystems are and what we can learn from them at different institutions. And you sort of just justified the whole reason for this webinar, so we can learn a little bit more about yours, and maybe in the future we can share some about some of our other systems, because they are so different. The resources are different. The geographic constraints and opportunities are different. So that's a point well taken. I want to give Jen an opportunity to weigh in on this question as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Keegan and Yossi did a really fantastic job addressing the question. Maybe I would just add for individuals, you know, thinking about spinning out a company, you know, that contact with customers kind of early on in the process is so important. And I know Keegan and Yossi already mentioned that, but I would say the university, kind of, I think regardless of which ecosystem you're in, is a great launch pad, and having that .edu email address is a great way to reach out, you know, to potential customers, and even just say like, hey, I came across your work, you know, I think it's really interesting, you know, I would love to learn more. So I think, you know, just using kind of the university environment and its emphasis on kind of, you know, openness in research, you know, as an opportunity to expand an individual's network, kind of regardless of what ecosystem they're in. Like it's so important to, you know, not just be maybe constrained by the confines of a university, but realize that by being at a university, you have kind of a much, you know, more opportunities to reach out to potential, you know, customers or end users, and, you know, just don't be afraid to connect with people on LinkedIn or cold email them. You may not hear back from many people, but yeah, I think especially if people want to start a company, yeah, outreach is just so important, kind of regardless of geographic constraints.
It's a great point. And you got to have a thick skin, right, Jen? Some of those folks don't respond, hurt your feelings, but you got to keep at it. So this idea of an innovation ecosystem, you guys are right on script. This is great. So the next question we have is, how would you describe an innovation ecosystem and why is it important for technology translation? I think I'll hand this one over to Keegan first, if that's okay. Keegan, do you want to take a shot at that one? And what is this complicated, as an environmental scientist in a previous life, I know what I think of as an ecosystem, but how would you define an innovation ecosystem and why is it important for this tech translation process?
Yeah, I'll just say having a robust ecosystem, I think, is important. We often say it takes a village to raise a startup or a founder. And so what does that village look like? I think what our students and some of our faculty value the most is just a community of peers to commiserate with. A lot of that has to do with instilling the sense of a little bit of risk taking, instilling the sense of getting outside of your comfort zone. And as much as faculty, as much as people in a lecturing setting try to instill that in people, it really comes from talking to peers and getting in that environment. So definitely community of peers. In addition to that, a lot of our folks need particular industry domain expertise when trying to launch a technology first venture. And so having a network of advisors or experts in particular industries have been very important for a lot of our teams. Support in terms of financial support through their innovation journey. A lot of our teams, they just need maybe $1,000 to go to a conference as their starting point. And that kind of sets them into a stage where then they apply to more money for, let's say, their first prototype, then more money for it. So having different funding mechanisms along their journey has been very important for our ecosystem. And I'll stop there.
Yossi?
I think Jen and Keegan covered a lot of it. Every venture that you build is gonna have its own path in life, but there are common patterns of what you need in terms of the environment around you. And I always like to backtrack and ask, okay, so when this is proven in the market and there really is some major value here and you'll need to grow, what will you need then? And then start backtracking. Okay, so how do I get to that point and so on? And by the way, in all of these stages, the sage advice from Jen holds, which is you need to talk to the customers, right? So as you backtrack and then you start to see, okay, so in all these stages, again, Keegan gave you some of the things that are needed to get you off the ground as well, right? As you backtrack. I think if you're talking about an ecosystem, is it a collection of individuals? What's the role of the institution that you're in within that ecosystem? Where are the gaps for your particular type of ventures that you're going to build? And is there someone who cares about that gap and will be there to help you close that gap that you will need? And if not, you'll have to do it yourself, right? So to me, that's how I would think about it. From the perspective of what you're building, rather than trying to create an ecosystem that sort of everything will work there for everyone very nicely. I just don't know how to do that.
Right.
Yeah, just a couple of additions. One of which is, when I mentioned chatting to the customer, for people who are thinking about, starting a company, there's a customer discovery process, right? So sometimes you don't even know who your customer is. And, just chatting to as many people as possible and learning about what their needs are, I think that's super important. One thing I learned early on, actually through StartX, is, end every conversation in who, like who else should I be talking to? Because that's a great way of expanding your network. And then just in terms of, an ecosystem, one thing that I learned, I don't want to say the hard way as a founder, but, it was a discovery process that sometimes people in different fields use the same vocabulary, but it means something quite different. And I think, to the extent that a university can provide an environment for, higher interaction cross-section, I guess like Keegan and Yossi were mentioning, for those different communities to come together and learn from each other, that's really important. Just to give, an example, when you start a company, sometimes you'll get SBIR funding. Usually at some point you need to get venture funding. And, hearing in the early days when I was thinking about entrepreneurship, about what, venture capitalists value, it sounded to me like they valued a lot of the same things, I did. Especially the deep tech investors, they want to make a positive impact on the world and address some of the biggest, challenges in, climate and sustainability, health, connectivity or information. But I guess in addition to what was said, there's also the, philosophy that investors, also want a return on investment. So they want big problems to address. And that's not just like the big hard science problems, but also the big market problems that nominally get them a return, within 5 to 15 years, depending upon the fund. So I think once I started to, not only understand kind of different, stakeholders, vocabulary, but what was meant by some of the words they were saying that maybe had the same, the same word used, but a slightly different meaning, it helped, just better close the loop on how important, the conversations can be between different communities.
Crazy. The more I hear you guys, the more questions I'm coming up with. So I want to try to be efficient with our time and not overload you. But I do have a couple of follow-ups for you guys off script, if that's okay. So one thing that really stuck out in what I just heard was the right funding at I heard community and I heard the right funding at the right time. I think it was expressed a little bit differently, but certainly investor funding versus SBIR funding, very different. So Jen, can I ask you to follow up a little bit more on that, the right funding at the right time? And if you've had SBIR funding and you've also had investment funding, can you just comment on maybe how grateful you were that you had SBIR funding when you did versus investor funding? Can you comment briefly on that, just the difference there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think the SBIR program is such a wonderful one, and I know NSF, NIH, DOE, DOD have really terrific programs to support early stage startups. I think it is probably one of the best programs that the US has for translating innovations, out of a university and into the world and into the hands of, end users. SBIR funding for kind of a seed grant or kind of a phase one SBIR funding is usually a smaller amount of funding. One thing that Stanford, to the best of my knowledge, allows individuals to do is apply for SBIR funding while they are still a Stanford affiliate, like a student or postdoc, for phase one funding. And I think that's great because it provides, just enough to cover, things like some salary, maybe some market research. Once you get to phase two, then it's more money, usually of order, maybe $1 to $2 million. And that's when I think the business can really start and get off the ground. Then you can, hire a small team or, move off campus. But when you start to scale your business, it's hard to do that one, SBIR grant at a time. And I think what VC funding allows for is speed. You can move, much faster with the amount of capital that venture can bring. I also think that having VC funding opens up an even larger community than is possible. I mean, venture groups are extremely well connected, have an incredible sense on like the pulse of the ecosystem. They have expertise in customer bases and business development. So I think the venture teams that I've worked with have been really instrumental in going from more of an academic pursuit. SBIR funding is also proposal driven, which is probably something most academics are quite familiar with, to actually running a business. That said, once you take on venture funding, my experience is that that really is when the clock is ticking, because they do want a return on their investment. So personally, I kind of thrive on that speed and the like high energy environment that comes with having venture funding. But it may be the case that certain technologies are not quite ready for that. So I would say know that when you get venture funding, that's a great inflection point, because you can accomplish so much more with that amount of capital. But then you really do want to make sure you help your investors return the fund to the best of your ability and start generating annual recurring revenue.
Yeah, there's an ROI and it goes beyond papers, right? It's um,
Yes, definitely.
the one thing that being that we're the NNCI is hosting this with us, infrastructure. So Keegan mentioned domain expertise. I want to ask about domain infrastructure. How important has it been that you have access to certain tools that can be challenging? I know here at Virginia Tech, we have startups who use our they use our electron microscopes and focused ion beams and that sort of thing. Maybe you can speak specifically to the pumpkin seed experience or some of the startups that Yossi, you or Keegan have worked with in the past. How critical has that infrastructure been to helping these startups take root and thrive?
Yeah, happy to start off with an anecdote. We had a student several years ago named Ted McElveen. He's working on a new hydrogen storage technology. He had great insights. He had some interesting technology. And as he was graduating, he said to me, Keegan, the availability of space and for me to work on my project is the determining factor as to whether I continue working on my startup or I take a real job somewhere else. And luckily, he was able to get some space and a little bit of equipment access, and he's off to the races. He won several grants, and now is a legitimate company running in San Francisco. And so I'm just echoing kind of your question, with the availability of space and access to equipment is crucial for a lot of our teams.
Yossi, Jid, anything to add, or are you good?
Yeah, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but yeah, space and infrastructure is so critical. We have definitely made use of the shared facilities at Stanford, which allow external industry users. Once you have SBIR funding, Stanford allows industry users to have generally a lower rate than other, more established industries. But I will say, we have also made use of DOE user facilities and national labs. Just want to put a plug in for the Foundry at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is a proposal-based user facility that allows essentially, free access to all of their, facilities, characterization, nanofabrication, if your proposal is awarded. So I know I mentioned the SBIR programs, which a lot of the government agencies support, but I also want to deeply acknowledge the DOE user facilities, which provide, unprecedented and really enabling access at no cost to state-of-the-art facilities, and especially when you're in, nanoscience or deep tech, it's hard to develop a commercial technology without access to those facilities.
Excellent. Yossi, any final thoughts? I know you see entrepreneurs from across technology domains. Some require more infrastructure, maybe some less.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to answer a different question. But I'm going to take this idea of infrastructure and say that there's resources that you need, right? And those resources could be space, they could be obviously capital, and different types of capital comes with different strings attached. But again, you need resources like people, you need resources like access to customers. And just to paraphrase, right? If you see a fork on the road, take it, right? Uh, when you need a resource and you want to find your way to get that resource. The one thing I would say is that certain resources have long-term implications on the success of your venture. And I love when Jen talked about, hey, venture capital, once you take it, it doesn't matter how much they care about all these other values that they care about. Their fiduciary responsibility to their investors is to bring a return on the fund. And that means that's what they need to deliver. And if they're sitting on your board and if they have control, they're going to push you in that direction. If you're not ready for that, it's your decision, it's your venture. But if that's where you want to get at the end, then actually, they may be the tool to accelerate you to that direction. But again, you have to be careful, right? Even though it sounds like it's money, it does matter where it comes from, especially when people can influence both the direction that you're going and provide you with more resources in the future. So to me, the whole question of resources, if there's what you need, and then there's the more challenging questions of trade-offs, and this is where you want to be careful with bringing in the long-term implication of your decisions.
I want to follow up on that with one quick question, and maybe it goes without saying, but I think it bears emphasizing by any of the panelists who wish to emphasize it, is the role of students, postdocs in your entrepreneurial ecosystem. What are some critical features there? Because I think we make some assumptions that students will be interested in some of these entrepreneurial ideas and be willing to spend time and effort in helping advance some of them and have interest in it. And I just want to see if any of you would like to comment on this, the importance of students and postdocs in this process, and maybe how you've specifically interacted with them at Stanford. Hopefully that question makes some sense. But I think they're an important part of the ecosystem. They're part of, Jen can't start and run and advance all these different companies. She needs postdocs who are interested, folks who come and join her lab and appreciate that she translates technology to market. And so maybe we'll start with you, Jen, on that one, just to get your thoughts on students and postdocs explicitly.
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much for asking about students and postdocs, because they really are, the heart and soul of any educational environment. And the work that I do, both in my lab and in translation, wouldn't be possible without an incredibly talented team of students and postdocs. Yeah, I would say as a, professor, my goal is, to help, educate and mentor students and postdocs and get them to the point that they wind up with, their ideal possible career when they finish their degree. And, sometimes at the start of their degree, they don't even know what that possible career is. So I view part of my role as helping them figure out, between all the possible options from, being a professor to going to a national lab to, industry, or, policy, communications, like what is a good fit, for that person. And for the folks who are leaning towards industry, kind of talking them through what are the differences between working at an established or working at a startup that's already up and running, but maybe a small team, working at a big industry, or actually starting a company. And going back to, Yossi's really, thoughtful comments at the start of the session on, kind of the, I guess, the attitude, right, of a scientist versus someone who's interested in business. I think to start a company, it really takes, someone who has an appetite, not only to do really outstanding, rigorous science, but to, understand the business side of things. And I guess I'm sure there are examples of teams where there was a great scientist and a great business person, and they kind of came together and were able to make it work. But at least in the companies I've seen spin out of Stanford, the students who are the most successful are the ones who, are able to work kind of across those disciplines. And that's where, yeah, spinning out a company, if you want to do it successfully, first of all, I think you need you know, a really amazing student who, nominally will be a founder and, there, through thick and thin, and who has that passion and that drive, but also his, yeah, able to get out, into the broader community and learn the business, take programs like the Ecopreneurship program or the Ignite program. Actually, all of my students who have founded companies have taken the Ignite program. And I've even had students who wanted to start companies who took the Ignite program and then learned they don't want to start a company, which I think is also a good success, right? Because it teaches them that, like, okay, maybe this is better done, with someone else spinning it out, and it's not for me. So.
Great response. Keegan or Yossi, anything to add on there?
Maybe a word about, there's a natural tension. I think just Jen covered it all, your question. So I'm going to answer another question there, which is that there's a bit of a natural tension within university and, especially with senior leadership, senior academic leadership, which is the concern that the top, the best talent that can push science forward will be lost to industry and business. And this is something I don't want to say that we should just assume it away and saying it's a simple win-win here. I think there is a real tension here, and we do want to make sure that the people who can push science forward and are the best people for academics really get to pursue their academic career and that's and preserve that. That does not mean that we can't have, and I think Stanford is a great example, we can't have just amazing cutting edge researchers. Yeah, I'm looking at one of them, right? That sort of pushes the envelope on research, but then also leverages science to really impact the world, right, in a better way through business. And that's not something to shy away from. I'm saying recognizing that tension and seeing where your institution is, where is the leadership in your institution. I think we're very lucky at Stanford that we have that and we have understanding and find that balance, but that's an important thing to do within your institution.
I want to make sure I'm giving everybody a chance to speak. So Keegan, feel free if there's anything you want to add there.
No, echoing everything Jen and Yossi said, we find tenure-line faculty typically do not leave their positions as faculty to become founders and run companies. Sometimes that actually does happen, but it's rare. And so the people who are leading the companies, we see usually as the PhD students, the postdocs, or other students that go through all these programs. So we see them as crucial components to translating the innovation into the real world.
Excellent. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we save a little bit of time there at the end if anyone wants to ask any questions. Also, I saw David's note. There's a Q&A link. Please feel free to enter questions there. And I will also post my email address in the chat near the end of the session, just in case there are any additional questions. But I did want to shift gears just a little bit because we've talked a lot about the positives here, and I want to confront some of the challenges that we face. So when you look at your, and again, I think this goes back to Yossi's point about the ecosystems are different everywhere. Some are going to have certain challenges, others are going to have others. Um, but can you look at some of the challenges in your own innovation ecosystem and maybe talk about what those are, and what's some advice you can share for fostering innovation ecosystems at other institutions or addressing some of these weaknesses that they might have. Hopefully that's a fair question, and you'll have some thoughts on that. And we'll start with you there, Keegan, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, something that immediately comes to my mind is Stanford has chosen to take a decentralized approach to its entrepreneurship programming. And I think this is something that is not shared by a lot of universities. But so Stanford has like 5 or 6 different entrepreneurship centers on campus, each with their own let's say, either a school affiliation or some thematic affiliation. And so thinking about challenges, decentralization brings its own challenge, because the programming and the pedagogy that is delivered to engineering students may look a little different from the pedagogy that's shown to our GSB students, for example, our business students. And sometimes that decentralization makes it a little harder for the interdisciplinary team formation that is often needed for our teams. The benefit of being decentralized is that no matter where your starting point is into your entrepreneurship journey, typically there's customized, tailored programming and education for that. So that it does have some benefit, but it definitely serves some challenge as well.
Yeah. Jen, Yossi, any thoughts on that?
Again, I think Keegan covered it. It's a case-by-case basis. I actually, I think for most people here, just thinking about that within their institution, I mean, that's what I take away from Keegan's answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think Keegan had, great insight that Stanford is decentralized, which is both a strength and a challenge, depending upon what the particular situation is. I spent probably, close to almost 10 years of my career, really focused on pretty fundamental science and research. And, only became interested in kind of entrepreneurship and translation probably as I got, post tenure and started to realize more so than, just papers and amazing students. I wanted to make sure some of our results got out into the world. And, in part because Stanford was so decentralized, I was not really aware of these programs. Like maybe they're well advertised to students, but maybe less well advertised to faculty. Maybe it's kind of assumed like, oh, faculty know what's around, but maybe depending upon your school or your department, they're not as well advertised. So I actually started to learn about Stanford's kind of innovation ecosystem through an external foundation, the Moore Foundation, which had a fellowship called the Moore Inventors Fellowship, where they want to fund, professors who are interested in, working on an invention and then translating it out. And I'd say for me, that was a program that was like a great way to learn about entrepreneurship and how to launch a business. And maybe ironically, that was how I learned about all the amazing programs that Stanford offers. So yeah, I do think that one of the challenges Stanford faces is it's big, and a lot of people in Stanford don't know what Stanford knows. So, you really need to do the legwork to figure out like what are all the programs that are out there. And I'm not sure, I'd have a great solution for that. When I was in a role overseeing upgrades to shared facilities, I kind of formed, basically there are over 40 shared facilities on campus, which, serve the broader research environment. And I wound up starting, what was called the Community for Shared Research Platforms, or C#. which is just kind of a virtual front door to any user who may want to use things like the nanofabrication facilities or the mass spec facilities or sequencing facilities. And yeah, maybe I don't know if things would ever, need to start from scratch at Stanford. I think it's working quite well, but potentially even something like a virtual front door, like, if you're interested in entrepreneurship, here are the, dozens and possibly even hundreds of programs that one can tap into. And I'm glad Stanford has so many, because there are many students who want to participate, and probably more students than, Yossi or Keegan can take in any one cohort. So it's great that students have, choices between Ignite, on, uh, ecopreneurship, biodesign, etc. But navigating those can be a challenge.
You're innovating on the webinar. So I think this is a really great point, this decentralized versus centralized aspect, because you don't want to stifle the innovation process, but you do want to equip people with the resources they need to be successful. And I guess you want to maybe avoid gatekeepers, such that there's a certain path that must be followed, but you do want to have the ability to get the resources where they need to be and punch above your weight. I can imagine in a resource constrained entrepreneurship ecosystem where it might be a little more necessary to bring resources together in a more concerted way. But I think it's a great point, and one that I don't necessarily hear a lot of from some smaller entrepreneurship ecosystems. We have a few other questions, but I see we have 7 minutes, and I want to try to wrap up here carefully. And I think one of the key remaining questions that I see here is how do we, everyone wants to learn a little bit from Stanford about how to do this in their own backyard. And maybe that's a question you guys get quite a bit, but I would like to hear your thoughts on what would be involved in scaling some of these programs beyond Stanford. What are, we might have folks in some of our other NNCI sites who want to be a part of what you're doing, or adopt some of those programs at their universities, and vice versa. Maybe we have some things in some of our other sites that could be shared across other sites. But can you comment on that? And in the meantime, I see we have a question in the Q&A, and I'll get to that now, but I'll tee that up first. Now, Keegan, you want to start there?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's tough for me to answer. When I think of scaling our programs, to say other universities or other locations, I see it as a localization problem. Similar to what Yossi was describing, every institution, every geography is going to be a little different and will have its own resources and pain points. And so as I think about scaling any of our programs, I think of, I can certainly share what we've seen work well in our environment, but there is going to be this localization aspect where some things may not translate. But I'll put it out to the group. If anybody wants to geek out about what is working, what is not in our programs, I'm always happy to chat, and feel free to reach out.
Very good. Yossi?
Yeah, so we did scale Ignite, Stanford Ignite. I mean, I ran the program in Beijing, Bangalore, Sao Paulo, Santiago, Paris, London, and even as far as New York. Again, with different groups of people, a lot of very technical talent. Again, the criteria was having no business background, but bringing really some cutting edge abilities with the individuals all over the world. And I would say, again, the business is not that different, right? Yes, the context matters, but the way I would do it is actually build it around real ventures. And that's what Ignite does. So take people's ideas or even businesses that are starting out and use those to really help the whole group sort of learn from the experience. And I think when you do that in your ecosystem, people will learn to address the challenges within your ecosystem. We found that to be, it was very successful. We're just a small business school, so it's not something we could sustain for many years, but we got unicorns coming out of Bangalore, more than 10 years ago, and we were in Beijing when the ecosystem was just beginning to bloom there. So it's doable. It's doable. And, happy to share sort of our approach to doing that.
Excellent. Jen, I'll give you the opportunity to respond too, if you'd like.
Cool. Yeah, maybe I'll take notes from Yossi and answer a different question. But I would say since we're nearing the top of the hour, a few really useful pieces of advice. One I already shared was end every conversation in who, to expand your network. And then the second piece of advice that I think is very useful is ask for advice, right? I guess like ask for advice, get money, ask for money, get advice. But I would say like as maybe other universities are thinking about innovation ecosystems and starting their own ecosystem, don't be afraid to ask for advice, whether from Stanford or other companies, other startups. And I think the more advice you get, eventually you converge on something that matches whatever your own particular goals are. And I think Stanford wouldn't be able to have the innovation ecosystem it has, without some really, incredible, donors, as well as the support of the university. So, I'm very grateful for the system that it has set up. And, I would imagine that, in setting it up, probably the leaders and innovators, asked for lots of advice and eventually got money to stand up programs like this. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out to others to ask for advice. And, then I think you wind up with a really virtuous cycle between the people who are able to fund the innovation programs and having a really strong, innovation ecosystem.
Excellent. Jen, we actually have a question for you that came through, and I wanted to make sure we have time to answer that in our last 2 minutes here. You mentioned that scientist founders can get stuck focused on a particular approach when they should be starting with the customer need. Why do you think this happens? And how would you advise graduate students to navigate the tension between the typical specificity of their graduate research and the diverse solutions required to start a successful venture? Maybe that's not a quick answer, but it's a great question.
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. I'll try to keep my answer succinct. I think part of it relates to maybe two things. One of which is kind of the scientific community and how it communicates results to each other. Often results are communicated, not only in papers, but at conferences. And I think it's important to go to conferences that don't just have, academic presenters and participants, but also have presenters from industry. And I think sometimes students and potentially even PIs tend to go to, academic conferences. They hear a really amazing talk. And then the student or the PI will think, okay, here's how I can improve upon what was just presented, right? Like, so you make a pretty significant improvement. It could be fundamental research, but if you actually are, let's say like the presenter was focused on diagnostics, and then you're like, oh, I can actually improve the diagnostic by doing X, Y, and Z and maybe make it more sensitive. But yeah, that is focusing on the approach and not the need, and saying, okay, like what is actually needed for diagnostics of disease X? Like it may not actually be sensitivity, right? It might be specificity, or it might be throughput. So I think, maybe, we all have this psychology of like a recency effect. What you hear last, you kind of think, oh, that's the most new. But, maybe I'd encourage people when they go to scientific talks to focus on that first slide, that problem statement, and then really like suss that out as they're defining, research problems by talking with people in industry who actually have that need in that topic area.
Excellent. Jen, folks, we are at time. I don't want to keep us on here longer. Thanks so much to our panelists. The recording for this webinar will be available on nnci.net. Please contact me if you have any additional questions. In Any final thoughts before we go? I do want to make a quick plug for our Nanotechnology Entrepreneurship Challenge offered through the NNCI. That'll be coming out soon. If you're interested in that, if you're a student, postdoc, you're interested in working on some of the problems that we're talking about today and being part of an innovation ecosystem, please contact me. Or your local, if you're at Stanford, contact some of your local folks there, Sarah Ostrowski and Debbie Sineski. My apologies. Okay, I feel like we're having to wrap up very quickly. Any final thoughts? Anyone need to get anything off their chest? No?
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Yeah, this is great. An hour goes by really quickly among friends. So
Mhm.
thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you to Matt. Thank you to our panelists from Stanford and our colleagues at Nano at Stanford for setting this up. And we'll see you on the next NNCI webinar. Bye, everybody.